Step out of the car. Now. The words cut through the night like a command that expected obedience, not conversation, and the flashing red and blue lights painted Alicia Carter's windshield in sharp, restless streaks as she tightened her grip on the steering wheel for just half a second longer than necessary before slowly releasing it, her breath steady, measured, controlled, like she had practiced this moment without ever wanting to. And outside her window, Officer Ryan Cole stood tall under the rotating lights, his shadow stretching across the asphalt, posture rigid, hand resting near his belt, eyes already filled with judgment before a single word had been exchanged. And when Alicia finally lowered the window, the cool night air slipped inside, carrying the faint hum of distant traffic and the quiet murmur of a city that never really noticed moments like this unless they turned loud. And Ryan leaned down slightly, his voice flat, procedural, but edged with something sharper. License and registration, he said, not asking, just stating. And Alicia reached for her purse slowly, deliberately, every movement careful, visible, her fingers brushing against the worn leather as she pulled out her ID, her gaze lifting just enough to meet his for a fraction of a second, not defiant, not afraid, just present. And something about that look lingered longer than it should have, like a reflection he didn't expect to see. And he took the card without a word, stepping back toward the cruiser as the radio crackled faintly at his shoulder, voices overlapping in static fragments that didn't quite land. And Alicia sat there in the quiet that followed, the ticking of her engine cooling beneath the hood, the faint vibration of the steering column still humming under her fingertips. And across the street, someone slowed down, headlights dimming slightly, as if instinct told them to watch, just for a second, just long enough to witness without getting involved. And when Ryan returned, his expression had hardened into something more certain, more decided, like whatever he thought he saw in her ID had confirmed a story he'd already written in his head. Step out of the vehicle, he said, and this time there was no mistaking the tone. And Alicia paused, not out of hesitation but calculation, the kind that lives in silence. Then she opened the door and stepped out into the glow of the lights, the asphalt cool beneath her shoes, the air sharper now. And for a brief moment, everything slowed, the flicker of the lights reflecting off the metal of the cruiser, the faint buzz of electricity overhead, the distant sound of a car door closing somewhere down the block. And she placed her hands where he could see them, calm, open, her posture straight, grounded. And when he moved closer, there was no anger in her face, no panic, just a quiet awareness that seemed to unsettle him more than resistance ever could. And as the metal clicked around her wrists, not harsh but firm enough to make a statement, Alicia exhaled softly, her voice low, almost gentle. "Do you always start with this?" she asked, not accusing, not pleading, just asking. And Ryan didn't answer, because in that moment, answering would have required him to think, and thinking would have meant slowing down. And slowing down was the one thing he wasn't prepared to do. Not tonight, not with the lights flashing, not with eyes watching, not with the weight of authority pressing against his back like it had something to prove. And somewhere behind him, the radio crackled again, louder this time, a name buried in the noise, repeated once, then twice, but still not heard. Not yet, not until it was almost too late. The night did not move, it held its breath, and Alicia Carter felt the stillness settle into her shoulders as the cool metal rested against her wrists, not painful, just present, a reminder of how quickly a moment could be decided by someone else. And across from her, Officer Ryan Cole shifted his stance slightly, adjusting his grip on control more than anything else, his jaw tight, his eyes scanning her again as if looking for something he had missed, something that would justify what had already been done. And yet the more he looked, the less certain he seemed, because she did not match the version of the story he had already chosen. She was too calm, too composed, her breathing steady like she was not standing under flashing lights on the side of a quiet American street, but somewhere else entirely, somewhere quieter, somewhere that did not rush to conclusions. And behind him the second officer lingered near the cruiser, glancing between them, uncertainty creeping into his posture as the radio at his shoulder crackled again, louder this time, the voice sharper, cutting through the background noise with a kind of urgency that did not belong to routine calls. And Ryan reached up instinctively, pressing the button but not fully listening. his attention still locked on Alicia as she tilted her head just slightly, her eyes lifting to meet his again, not challenging, not submissive, just steady, and she spoke in that same, even tone, the kind that did not need to be loud to be heard. "You might want to listen," she said, and for a fraction of a second, something flickered across his face, hesitation, the smallest crack in certainty, but it passed just as quickly, replaced by the weight of habit, of training, of expectation, and he looked away, choosing not to engage with what he did not understand. And somewhere down the street a car slowed, tires rolling softer against the pavement, headlights dimming as if the driver sensed something unfolding that was not meant to be interrupted, and the air carried that quiet tension, thick and unmoving, the kind that builds before something shifts. And Alicia lowered her gaze for a moment, not in defeat but in thought, her mind moving through something deeper than the surface of the situation. And when she looked back up, there was a subtle change, not in her posture, not in her expression, but in the way she held the silence, like she was allowing it to stretch just enough for the truth to arrive on its own. And then the radio broke through again, unmistakable this time, her name spoken clearly, distinctly, repeated with authority that did not ask for attention but demanded it, and Ryan froze, not completely, not visibly, but enough that his hand hovered for half a second longer than it should have before reaching for the device. And the second officer turned sharply, eyes widening as the words finally landed, and Alicia watched it happen. The exact moment recognition began to form, slow, reluctant, undeniable. And she did not rush to fill the silence. She did not interrupt. She simply stood there, grounded, waiting, because some truths did not need to be spoken loudly. They only needed to be heard at the right moment. The radio did not just speak this time. It cut clean through everything, sharp and undeniable. "All units, confirm status on Captain Alicia Carter," and the name hung in the air like something heavy that no one could ignore anymore. And Ryan Cole felt it before he fully processed it. A shift, subtle but immediate, like the ground beneath his certainty had just tilted slightly off balance, and his fingers tightened around the radio as he brought it closer, his voice catching for the smallest fraction of a second before he answered, slower now, less certain. "Repeat that," he said, but the response came back even clearer, more direct, as if the night itself had decided there was no room left for misunderstanding. "Captain Alicia Carter has arrived in your sector, confirm visual," and behind him, the second officer stepped closer, eyes moving quickly from the radio to Alicia and back again, the pieces beginning to fall into place in a way that made silence feel louder than any command. And Ryan turned, slowly this time, really looking at her, not just at her clothes or her car or the situation he thought he was managing, but at her, her posture still straight, her shoulders relaxed, her expression unchanged, calm in a way that no one in her position was expected to be. And then his eyes dropped, just for a moment, to the name on the identification he still held, Carter, the same name that had just echoed through the radio. And something in his chest tightened, not fear exactly, but the recognition of a mistake that could no longer be undone by ignoring it. And Alicia watched the realization arrive, not with satisfaction, not with anger, but with a quiet patience that felt almost heavier than either. And when she finally spoke, her voice did not rise, it did not sharpen, it remained exactly as it had been from the beginning, steady, measured, certain. "You heard them," she said, and the words were simple, but they landed with a weight that filled the space between them, and Ryan opened his mouth as if to respond. But nothing came out at first, because whatever he had planned to say no longer fit the reality in front of him, and the second officer shifted again, clearing his throat softly, the sound small but enough to break the stillness, and Ryan's hand moved, almost automatically, toward the cuffs, then stopped, hovering there as hesitation finally took hold in a way it had not before. And Alicia did not move to help him, did not rush the moment. She simply stood there, letting him face it, letting him choose, and in that silence, the flashing light seemed less like authority and more like exposure, illuminating everything that had just happened, every assumption, every decision, every second that could not be taken back. And somewhere in the distance, a door closed, a car passed, life continuing as if this moment did not matter. But here, under those lights, it mattered completely, because this was the point where power shifted, not with force, not with volume, but with truth. And Ryan finally looked up at her again. Really looked this time. And for the first time since he had stepped out of his cruiser, he did not look like the one in control. Ryan Cole felt the weight of the moment settle into his chest like something heavier than his badge, heavier than the uniform he had trusted to guide him through every decision up until now. And his hand, still hovering near the cuffs, finally moved with a hesitation that did not belong to the officer who had stepped out of the cruiser just minutes ago. And as the metal loosened, the small sound of it releasing seemed louder than it should have been, echoing in the quiet space between them. And Alicia Carter did not pull away immediately. She let the moment finish, let him complete what he had started, because this was not about speed, it was about recognition. And when her hands were free, she lowered them slowly, rubbing one wrist gently, not in complaint, not in accusation, just grounding herself in the reality of what had happened. And Ryan stepped back half a pace, not instructed, not ordered, just instinctively creating distance where there had once been control. And the second officer looked between them, uncertain whether to speak or remain silent, his earlier confidence replaced by something quieter, something more aware, and the radio remained still now, as if it had already said everything that needed to be said. And for a few seconds, no one moved, the flashing lights continuing their rhythm, casting shifting colors across Alicia's face, across Ryan's uniform, across the pavement that suddenly felt less like a stage for authority and more like a mirror, reflecting choices. And Alicia lifted her gaze again, meeting Ryan's eyes. And there was no anger there, no raised voice waiting to follow, just a calm that carried its own kind of weight. "What matters is what you do next," she said. And the sentence was simple, but it did not leave room for avoidance. And Ryan swallowed, the movement subtle but visible, as if he was trying to find something to say that would make sense of the last few minutes, something that would restore the version of himself he believed in. But nothing came easily, because this was not a situation that could be explained away with procedure or routine. This was something else, something that reached deeper than that. And he finally spoke, his voice lower now, stripped of the earlier edge. "I did not know," he said. And Alicia gave the smallest nod, acknowledging the truth in the words without excusing the action behind them. "You did not ask," she replied, and that landed differently, quieter but sharper, because it was not an accusation, it was a fact, and facts were harder to argue with. And the second officer shifted again, glancing down briefly as if replaying the moment in his own mind, seeing where it had turned, where it could have gone differently. And the night seemed to settle around them again, but not the same as before. This quiet was different, heavier with awareness. And Alicia took a slow breath, then stepped forward, not to close the distance in confrontation, but to stand where she had been placed earlier, under the lights, in full view. And she adjusted her jacket slightly, composed, steady, and when she spoke again, her voice carried a calm authority that did not need to announce itself loudly. "We are going to talk about this," she said, not as a threat, not as punishment, but as something inevitable. And Ryan nodded, not out of obligation, but because for the first time that night, he understood that this moment was not over, it had only just begun. The flashing lights continued their slow rotation, but the urgency that had filled the air moments ago had shifted into something quieter, something heavier, like the scene itself was trying to understand what had just unfolded. And Alicia Carter stood still for a second longer than expected, not because she needed to, but because she wanted the moment to settle, to be felt, not rushed past. And Ryan Cole watched her, his posture no longer rigid but uncertain, as if he was standing in a place he did not recognize, one where authority did not come from the badge on his chest, but from the truth in front of him. And the second officer stepped back toward the cruiser, giving space without being told, his earlier confidence replaced by a quiet awareness that made him look down more than up. And Alicia finally moved, slow and deliberate, stepping toward the front of the cruiser, where the light hit her directly, illuminating her face clearly now, no shadows, no distortion, just presence. And she glanced briefly at the phone still recording from across the street, acknowledging without reacting, because this was not about the audience, it was about what happened next. And when she turned back to Ryan, her expression remained composed, her voice calm but firm. "Tonight was not supposed to be about me. she said. And that line carried something deeper than explanation. It carried intention, purpose, the reason she had been out here in the first place. And Ryan listened. Really listened now. Not preparing a response, not defending himself, just absorbing the words as they came, and Alicia took a small breath before continuing. But it became about how decisions are made when no one is watching closely. And that landed in a way that did not accuse but revealed, like holding up a mirror without forcing someone to look into it. And Ryan's eyes dropped for a moment. Not in shame exactly, but in recognition, the kind that settles slowly and stays longer than discomfort. And the silence stretched again, but this time it was not empty. It was full of something unspoken, something changing, and Alicia stepped slightly to the side, giving him a clearer view of the road, the quiet neighborhood, the ordinary setting that made the moment feel even more significant. Because nothing about this place suggested importance, and yet everything about this moment was, and she spoke again, softer now, but no less clear. This is where it starts, she said, and Ryan looked up, meeting her eyes again. And for the first time there was no resistance in his gaze, just understanding beginning to take shape, and the second officer shifted his weight, glancing between them as if realizing that this was not just a traffic stop, not just a mistake, but something that would follow them beyond this street, beyond this night, into every decision that came after. And Alicia nodded once, almost to herself, as if confirming that what needed to happen next was already set in motion. And the lights continued to flash, but they no longer felt like control. They felt like exposure, like everything had been seen clearly, and there was no going back to how it was before. The air shifted again, not with noise but with awareness, and Alicia Carter let the silence stretch just a second longer before she moved, stepping away from the direct glare of the cruiser lights, her shoes making a soft, steady sound against the asphalt. And Ryan Cole watched her without speaking, his posture no longer anchored in authority, but in something quieter, something uncertain that had begun to take root. And for the first time that night, he seemed aware of how visible everything was: the lights, the street, the people who had slowed down just enough to witness, and most of all, himself, standing there in a moment that could not be undone. And Alicia stopped near the edge of the curb, turning slightly, so she faced both officers, not above them, not below them, just present, and she folded her hands loosely in front of her, a small, grounded gesture that carried more control than any raised voice ever could. And when she spoke, her tone remained even, but there was a deeper layer now, something that carried experience, not just position. You followed a pattern, she said, and Ryan's eyes narrowed slightly, not in defiance, but in concentration, as if trying to understand where she was going. And she continued without pause. A quick decision, a quick assumption, and no pause to ask if you were right. And the words settled into the space between them, not sharp, not loud, but undeniable. And Ryan shifted his weight, the movement small but telling, as if he could feel the truth of it landing somewhere he had not expected. And the second officer glanced up briefly, then back down again, the rhythm of his breathing slower now, more measured, like he was beginning to replay the moment in his own mind, step by step. And Alicia took another small step forward, closing the distance just enough to make the conversation feel direct, personal, unavoidable. And she looked at Ryan steadily, not searching for guilt, not demanding an apology, just asking for recognition. "Do you remember the reason you pulled me over?" she asked, and Ryan opened his mouth, then paused, the answer not coming as quickly as it should have, because in truth, the reason had already been overshadowed by everything that followed. And that realization alone was enough to shift something deeper. And Alicia nodded slightly, not as judgment, but as confirmation, and she spoke again, softer now, but more precise. "That is where it changes," she said, and the sentence carried weight, not as a correction, but as an invitation to see differently. And Ryan finally exhaled, a slow breath that seemed to release more than just tension. And when he looked back at her, there was something new in his expression, not confidence, not authority, but awareness, the kind that does not come easily and does not leave quickly. And the night remained still around them, but it no longer felt like a pause. It felt like a turning point, quiet, steady, and impossible to ignore. Ryan did not answer right away, and that silence said more than anything he could have put into words, because for the first time that night, he was not reacting. He was thinking, really thinking, and Alicia Carter saw it happen, the shift behind his eyes, the moment where instinct gave way to reflection, and she did not interrupt it. She let it unfold, because growth never came from pressure, it came from recognition. And the night seemed to lean into that pause, the distant hum of traffic. Soft, the flashing lights no longer urgent but steady, like a heartbeat that had slowed down. And the second officer stood a few steps back now, no longer trying to fill the space, his posture quieter, his presence more aware, as if he understood that whatever was happening here was not something to step into. It was something to witness, and Alicia took a small breath, her shoulders relaxed, her stance grounded, and she spoke again, her voice carrying that same calm authority that did not need volume to be felt. This job is not about being right in the moment, she said, and Ryan's gaze lifted slightly, drawn back to her. It is about being responsible for the moment after, and that landed deeper, not as instruction, but as truth, something that could not be easily dismissed, and Ryan's hand moved unconsciously toward his belt, then stopped, as if even that familiar motion no longer felt certain, and he nodded once, slowly, the movement small but real, and Alicia noticed it, not with approval, not with judgment, just acknowledgement, because this was not about winning, it was about understanding, and she stepped closer by a single pace, enough to bring her voice into a space that felt more personal, more direct. You had a choice back there, she continued, a moment to pause, to ask one more question, to see one more detail. And Ryan swallowed again, the memory of those seconds replaying now with a clarity that had not existed before, and he exhaled quietly. I did not take it, he said, and the admission was simple, but it carried weight, because it was honest, and Alicia gave a slight nod, her expression unchanged, but something softer passed through her eyes, not forgiveness, not yet, but recognition of truth, and the second officer shifted again, this time lifting his gaze fully, as if realizing that this moment was not just about one person, it was about all of them, about the way they showed up when no one stopped them. And Alicia looked between them briefly, then back to Ryan, and the silence returned, but it was different now, not heavy, not tense, but clear, like a space where something new had room to exist, and she spoke one more time, her voice steady, grounded, final in a way that did not need emphasis. What you do next will matter more than what you did before. And Ryan held her gaze, not as an officer, not as someone in control, but as someone who had just seen something he could not unsee. And for the first time that night, he did not look like he was trying to prove anything. He looked like he was ready to learn. The silence that followed did not feel empty. It felt intentional, like the night itself had stepped back to give the moment space to settle. And Alicia Carter stood there with the same quiet steadiness, her presence no longer defined by what had happened to her, but by what she was choosing to do with it. And Ryan Cole remained where he was, his shoulders slightly lowered now, the tension that had once driven his movements replaced by something more reflective, something slower, and he glanced briefly at the cruiser, then back at Alicia, as if trying to recalibrate himself in a situation that no longer followed the rules he was used to. And for a second, he looked like he was about to speak, but stopped, choosing instead to listen, really listen, and Alicia noticed that. The difference between reacting and receiving, and she gave the smallest nod, not to encourage, not to reward, but to acknowledge the shift, and she turned slightly, her gaze moving down the quiet street, taking in the stillness, the ordinary homes, the soft glow of porch lights, the kind of place where moments like this often passed without being understood. And then she spoke again, her voice calm, grounded, carrying a weight that came from experience rather than authority. Most people will never know this moment happened, she said, and Ryan's eyes followed her gaze down the street, seeing it differently now, not just as a location, but as a context, a place where decisions shaped lives quietly, without headlines, without witnesses who stayed long enough to understand. And Alicia continued, that is why it matters. And the simplicity of the statement made it land deeper, because it did not rely on explanation, it relied on truth. And the second officer shifted again, this time lifting his head fully, his expression no longer uncertain, but thoughtful, as if he was beginning to see his role in it too, and Alicia turned back to them. Her posture still relaxed, her tone unchanged, but there was something firmer now, something that pointed forward. What happens next is not about correction, she said. It is about intention. And Ryan nodded again, more clearly this time, the movement no longer hesitant, and he took a small step forward, not to reclaim control, but to stand in the moment more fully, and when he spoke, his voice was quieter, but more certain. I understand, he said, and Alicia held his gaze for a second, measuring not the words, but the meaning behind them, and then she gave a slight nod, accepting not the statement, but the effort, and the lights continued to flash around them. But they no longer felt like a signal of authority, they felt like a reminder, a visual echo of a moment that had already changed direction, and somewhere in the distance, a car turned the corner and disappeared, the world continuing as it always did. But here, in this small space of stillness and realization, something had shifted in a way that would not easily be undone, and Alicia took one final breath, steady and controlled, as if marking the end of one moment and the beginning of another. The moment did not end, it deepened, settling into something quieter but far more lasting, and Alicia Carter could feel it in the way the air held steady, no longer tense, no longer uncertain, but reflective, like the space itself had absorbed what had just taken place, and she shifted her weight slightly, her stance still grounded, her presence calm in a way that did not need to be announced, and Ryan Cole stood across from her, his shoulders no longer squared in defense, but relaxed in a way that suggested something inside him had changed, not completely, not instantly, but enough to matter, and he looked down briefly at his hands, then back up at her, as if measuring the distance between who he had been a few minutes ago and who he was now, and it was not a comfortable distance, but it was real, and the second officer remained near the cruiser, quieter than before, his gaze no longer drifting but focused, as if he understood that this moment was not just about watching, it was about remembering. And Alicia let the silence sit for another second. Then she spoke, her voice steady, deliberate, carrying the kind of clarity that did not need emphasis. This is not about one stop, she said, and Ryan listened without interrupting, his attention fully on her now. It is about every moment that looks like this and ends differently. And the words landed with a quiet weight, expanding beyond the street, beyond the night, into something larger that could not be easily ignored. And Ryan nodded slowly, the movement more certain now, not just acknowledgement, but understanding beginning to take root. And Alicia continued, her tone unchanged but her words more precise. You do not get to choose when responsibility matters, she said. It is always there. And Ryan exhaled softly, the breath longer this time, like he was releasing something he had been holding without realizing it. And he spoke again, his voice still low, but clearer. I see that now, he said, and Alicia studied him for a brief moment, not searching for perfection, not expecting transformation, just looking for truth, and she found enough of it to nod once. And then she turned slightly, her gaze moving back toward her car, the simple, ordinary vehicle that had become the center of something much larger than itself. And she took a small step in that direction, then paused, turning back just enough to meet his eyes one more time. And when she spoke again, her voice carried a finality that did not close the moment but moved it forward. What you do after this will define what this meant, she said, and Ryan held her gaze, not with resistance, not with defensiveness, but with a quiet acceptance that felt new, unfamiliar, but necessary, and the lights continued to flash behind him, casting shifting colors across the scene. But they no longer felt like control or authority, they felt like a reminder of what had been revealed, and Alicia gave one last nod, not as approval, not as dismissal, but as acknowledgement that the moment had reached its turning point, and then she began to walk back toward her car, her steps steady, unhurried, leaving behind not silence, but something deeper, something that would stay long after the lights were gone. Alicia Carter reached her car, but did not open the door right away, her hand resting lightly against the cool surface as the flashing lights reflected across the window in slow, fading patterns, and behind her, the silence stretched once more, but this time it carried a different weight, not tension, not uncertainty, but consequence, and Ryan Cole stood where she had left him, his gaze fixed not on her but on the space she had just walked through, as if trying to understand how something so brief had managed to shift so much, and the second officer glanced at him, waiting, not for an order, but for direction, for something that would define what came next, and Ryan finally moved, a small step forward that felt heavier than it should have, his boots pressing against the pavement with a quiet certainty that had not been there before, and he looked down the street, then back at Alicia, and for a moment, it seemed like he might say something, might try to fill the space with words that could ease what had happened, but he stopped himself, because for the first time, he understood that not every moment needed to be spoken over, some needed to be carried, and Alicia sensed the shift without turning, her posture unchanged, her presence steady, and she opened the car door slowly, the soft sound of it cutting gently through the night, and before she stepped in, she paused, just long enough to acknowledge that what had happened behind her was not finished, it had only changed form, and Ryan took another step forward, his voice finally breaking the quiet, lower now, stripped of the certainty it once held. "Captain," he said, and the word landed differently than any title spoken earlier that night, not as recognition of rank, but as acceptance of reality, and Alicia turned slightly, not fully, just enough to meet his eyes again. And there was no triumph there, no satisfaction, just the same calm presence that had guided every moment so far, and Ryan held her gaze, then nodded once, a gesture that carried more meaning than any explanation could have, and she returned the nod, small, deliberate, acknowledging not the mistake, but the understanding that followed it, and without another word, she stepped into the car, the interior quiet and still, a contrast to the lights outside, and as she closed the door, the sound felt final in a way that marked the end of one moment and the beginning of another. And Ryan stood there as the engine came to life, the low hum steady, grounded, and he watched as the car pulled away slowly, not rushing, not escaping, just moving forward, and the lights from the cruiser reflected briefly across the rear window before fading. And when the car disappeared down the street, the night returned to its usual rhythm, but nothing about it felt the same, and Ryan exhaled deeply, the breath long, measured, as if releasing something he would not pick up again, and he turned back toward the cruiser, not as the same officer who had stepped out of it earlier, but as someone who now understood that authority was not what defined him, it was what he chose to do with it, and the second officer watched him quietly, then followed, both of them stepping into a night that looked unchanged, but felt entirely different. The road ahead was empty again, just a stretch of asphalt under soft streetlights, but Ryan Cole did not see it the same way anymore, and as he stood beside the cruiser, the engine idling low, he rested his hand briefly on the hood, feeling the faint vibration beneath his palm like a reminder that everything still moved forward whether you were ready or not, and the second officer waited by the passenger side, quieter than usual, his earlier instincts replaced by observation, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, not because there was nothing to say, but because they both understood that anything said too quickly would miss the point entirely. And Ryan finally walked around to the driver's side, opening the door slowly, not with urgency, but with intention, and before getting in, he paused, looking down the street where Alicia Carter's car had disappeared, the darkness now undisturbed, and he replayed the moment in his mind, not the flashing lights or the commands, but the pause he had ignored, the question he had not asked, the assumption he had allowed to lead, and it sat with him heavier than any reprimand ever could, and he lowered himself into the seat, the familiar interior of the cruiser suddenly feeling different, not wrong, just changed, like a place he had known but never truly examined, and as he reached to turn off the overhead lights, his hand hesitated for a second, then moved deliberately, and the red and blue reflections faded, leaving only the quiet glow of the dashboard, soft and steady, and the absence of those lights made the street feel more real, less like a scene and more like what it had always been, just a place where choices were made, and the second officer got in as well, closing the door with a muted sound, and for a few seconds, the only noise was the low hum of the engine and the faint crackle of the radio, settling back into routine traffic, and then the second officer spoke, his voice careful, not casual. "That was different," he said, and Ryan nodded once, his eyes still forward. "It was," he replied, and the simplicity of the exchange carried more weight than anything more elaborate could have, and the second officer shifted slightly in his seat, glancing at Ryan as if expecting more, but Ryan did not elaborate, because he was still processing, still aligning what had happened with what it meant, and he reached for the steering wheel, his grip firm but not tense, and he took a slow breath before speaking again, this time more to himself than anyone else. Next time, I ask first, and the words were quiet, almost lost in the hum of the car, but they carried a decision, not a reaction, and the second officer nodded, understanding that this was not just about one stop. It was about every moment that would come after, and Ryan shifted the cruiser into drive, the movement smooth, controlled, and as they pulled away from the curb, the tires rolling softly against the pavement, the night continued around them as it always had. But inside the car, something had changed, something that would follow them into every call, every stop, every decision. And as the cruiser turned onto the next street, Ryan glanced once in the rearview mirror, not to check what was behind him, but to acknowledge what he was leaving there. And then he looked forward again, the road ahead no longer just a path, but a responsibility he now understood differently. The cruiser moved steadily through the quiet streets, the soft glow of streetlights passing over the windshield in slow intervals, and Ryan Cole kept his eyes forward, both hands on the wheel, his posture more grounded than before, as if he was no longer driving out of habit, but out of awareness, and beside him, the second officer sat in silence, no longer filling the space with casual remarks, understanding that this was not a moment to interrupt, but to absorb, and the radio murmured with routine calls, distant voices discussing locations and times, but none of it felt as immediate as what had already happened, and Ryan listened differently now, not just to the words, but to the pauses between them, the details that could easily be overlooked if you were not paying attention. And as they approached an intersection, the light turned yellow, then red, and Ryan slowed the cruiser smoothly, coming to a complete stop, the engine idling quietly beneath them, and for a moment, everything felt still again, not because nothing was happening, but because this pause meant something now, and Ryan glanced briefly at the crosswalk, empty except for a faint shadow stretching across the painted lines, and he exhaled slowly, the breath controlled, intentional, like he was resetting something inside himself, and the second officer shifted slightly, then spoke, his voice careful. "You really think it changes that fast?" he asked, not challenging, just curious, and Ryan kept his eyes on the road ahead, considering the question, and after a second, he answered. "It does not change fast," he said, his tone steady. "It changes one decision at a time." And the words hung there, simple but grounded, and the light turned green, and Ryan eased the cruiser forward again, the movement smooth, unhurried, and as they drove, a car passed in the opposite direction, its headlights briefly illuminating their faces before fading into the distance, and Ryan noticed the reflection in the windshield, his own expression calmer, more focused, less reactive, and he thought about the moment again, not replaying it with regret, but examining it with purpose, understanding that what mattered was not the mistake itself, but what it revealed, and ahead, a pedestrian stood at the corner, waiting, and Ryan slowed instinctively, giving space, giving time, and the person crossed without hesitation, a small, ordinary interaction, but it felt different now, more intentional, more aware, and the second officer watched it happen, then nodded slightly, not saying anything, because the action spoke clearly enough, and Ryan continued down the road, the city stretching out in quiet patterns of light and shadow, and he realized that nothing about the streets had changed, nothing about the job had changed, but the way he moved through it had, and that was where it mattered, and as the cruiser disappeared into the distance, it did not carry the urgency it had before, it carried something steadier, something more deliberate, like a rhythm that had finally been understood. The city moved on as it always did, lights shifting, cars passing, quiet lives continuing behind closed doors, but inside the cruiser, something had settled into place, not loud, not dramatic, just steady, and Ryan Cole kept his hands on the wheel, his movements measured, deliberate, like each turn and each stop now carried meaning beyond routine, and the second officer sat beside him, no longer questioning, no longer filling the silence, because he could feel it too, the difference, the shift. that did not need to be explained to be understood. And as they drove past another intersection, Ryan slowed again, not because he had to, but because he chose to, his eyes scanning not just for violations, but for context, for presence, for the details that used to blur together before. And in that small change, something larger began to take shape, something quieter but stronger than authority alone, and the radio spoke again. Another call, another location, another situation waiting to unfold, and Ryan reached for it, his voice calm, grounded. Unit responding, he said, and there was no hesitation this time, no edge, just clarity. And as he turned the cruiser toward the next street, the headlights cutting clean lines through the dark, he felt the weight of responsibility differently, not as pressure, but as purpose. And the second officer glanced at him, then nodded slightly, not out of habit, but out of recognition, because he had seen the moment where it changed, and he knew it would not go back, and the road stretched ahead, quiet but open, and Ryan followed it without rushing, without forcing, just moving forward with a steadiness that had not been there before. And somewhere behind them, the place where everything had shifted returned to stillness, the flashing lights gone, the street empty again, but not untouched, because moments like that did not disappear, they stayed, in memory, in choice, in the way someone showed up the next time it mattered. And Alicia Carter drove on as well, her hands steady on the wheel, her gaze forward, the night unfolding ahead of her like it always did. But she did not look back. She did not need to, because the work was never about one moment. It was about what that moment changed in others. And as her car merged into the quiet rhythm of the city, her reflection briefly caught in the rearview mirror, calm, composed, present. She allowed herself a single slow breath, then let it go. And the road continued, carrying both of them in different directions, but connected by something unseen, something that would surface again in choices, in pauses, in the space between action and awareness. And the night held it all without judgment, without noise, just a quiet understanding that not every change needed to be seen to matter. And as the cruiser disappeared into the distance, and Alicia's car blended into the flow of traffic, the city remained the same, but the people within it were not, and that was enough.